Wars, natural disasters, terror attacks, and pandemics. There is no shortage of fire-eating things happening in the world today. We turn to the news to try to get a sense of what's going on. And that's often exploited by malign actors who try to find scapegoats or create mistrust in public authorities. Good evening. My name is Maia Mazurkiewicz, and welcome to the anatomy of disinformation. When crises emerge, information pollution rises. People repeat misinformation and spread hate speech or propaganda. All of this creates an even greater crisis in public opinion and even affects how we think. The recent flooding in Poland saw a parallel flood of disinformation. Today, we're going to talk about how bad actors can leverage crisis in our information space. Disinformation is one of the tactics used by malign actors to influence public opinion. When we experience fear, our brains get tunnel vision, and we start following information that matches our existing beliefs. And when a crisis or black swan event happens, we try to make sense of it. But is that possible? And is strategic communication an answer to the problem of disinformation? My first guest is here to help us figure that out.
Jon Roozenbeek, Assistant Professor of Psychology and Security at King's College London. His work focuses on digital media effects, polarization, and intergroup conflict. He's the author of 2 recent books, Propaganda and Ideology in the Russian-Ukrainian War and The Psychology of Misinformation.
Jon, thank you so much for joining us from London at the next episode of Anatomy of Disinformation. Today we have a particular one. We're going to talk about disinformation during crisis. Different operation influence are being tested and usually used while the crisis emerge. And in Poland in particular, just a few weeks ago, we had big floods, and that also caused a flood of disinformation. What are you seeing in particular while you're looking at crisis disinformation? Is it usual thing that disinformation is emerging?
Yes, absolutely. It happens very frequently, if not always. Part of the reason for that is there's a high degree of urgency, right? So people are really demanding information during a time of crisis. And if they can't find it, then oftentimes people or organizations or even well-meaning individuals can kind of jump into that uncertainty void and provide information that turns out not to be accurate.
So this uncertainty is the biggest vulnerability, right, that is being used in here? And,
in times of crisis, yes.
And in terms of psychology, what is being used in here to actually access our minds, right, with those operation influence?
That's a very interesting question. So a couple of things happen at the same time, right? So in times of uncertainty, we are more psychologically wired to not only want more information, but also to kind of ascertain what we want to be true. Or in some cases, we really need kind of access to information immediately, such as where do I go to be safe, right? And so what happens is we have a strong desire to be informed, which can mean that we set aside our considerations around accuracy, right? Because we think like, well, I don't know if this is true exactly, but I'm not going to risk it. If it is true, the risk for me is too high not to accept this. Therefore, I'm going to act upon this information as if it were true, right? And that can be very dangerous, especially if the information turns out to be false.
You've been saying also that during the recent happenings in UK?
Yes, so this happened very recently, actually. There was an instance of a terrible crime being committed at a school. And in a time like that, people are obviously trying to find out who did it, right? And they're very angry and they're very emotional. All of that is very, very understandable. But unfortunately, that led to rumors spreading about a particular individual having been involved from a particular background, in this case, a Muslim, right, which turned out not to be true. Or at least this wasn't the crime was not committed by someone who had immigrated to the UK via boat, who had a Muslim background. it was a different story than that. But because that story tapped so well into not only the emotional component, but also into latent sentiments around immigration, it went massively viral and sparked, or at least in part contributed to sparking riots later on, which was a tremendous issue, yeah.
And do you think it also changed the attitudes in UK already, or was it rather built on something that was already emerging and visible?
It's really hard to say. What tends to happen is that people believe certain things, but like aren't really kind of talking about it a whole lot, or it's kind of they're worried about other things, and then an incident like this or misinformation, perhaps in a more general sense, can sort of increase the urgency of these sentiments. And that then contributes to those sentiments being expressed, which can then mean that people act upon them also, which is they go out into the streets and they protest and so on.
One of the biggest crises that may happen is a war. And we're having right now a war on our border, that is war in Ukraine, but also happenings in the Middle East. Are the same examples being used in there? And the techniques, tactics, and procedures?
Yes. So with any war comes also the fog of war, right? And so what, in this case, the Russian Federation has tried to do, and what is also happening in Israel, Palestine, and in Lebanon, is that there is this massive kind of uncertainty, but also, again, a strong desire to have information and accurate information available. And let's say in the case of Russia, Russia kind of jumped into that, trying deliberately to mislead people about the causes of the war, about how the war is going, about they tried to spread a deep fake about President Zelensky surrendering, right? So these are all efforts that in combination seek to make the information component part of the battlefield, right? So that's why we call it information warfare, right? The idea that you have the narratives on your side, that you are kind of talking about the war in the way that you want to talk about it, the way you're kind of trying to persuade or mislead people or lie to them, and all these things. These are considered to be, at least in part by some individuals within the Russian Federation, especially Valery Gerasimov, who is the chief of staff of the armed forces, who consider this informational component to be so important that they consider it a real kind of part of warfare, right? Not just a theoretical part of warfare, but a real one.
And those operations influence, you can see both in Ukraine and in the Western world, right?
Yes, of course.
And how
yes,
those narratives,
so,
how those narrative differs?
So they differ in a million different ways, but sort of from a strategic standpoint, right? Ukraine's efforts here are directed at maintaining support from their allies, from Western powers, maintaining internal support among Ukrainians, particularly Russian-speaking Ukrainians, who are often the target of Russian disinformation campaigns. So that's one side. And then from the Russian side, the efforts are at weakening support for Ukraine among Western powers. It's one major thing that they care about, right? So they invest a lot in influencers in the West, in all sorts of countries, basically spreading narratives about Ukraine losing, about Ukraine not being worth the effort, and all these kinds of things. But then also for the Russian Federation, there's a big component about maintaining support and projecting this narrative that it's Russians against the rest, right? So all ethnic Russians and Russian speakers need to band together because everyone else is out to get them. And that isn't true, of course, right, in many different ways, but that is one of the ways in which they try to seek and build support for what they are doing.
Exactly, Jon. So the last question, what can be a best response? Is strategic communication the answer?
Strategic communications is one part of the answer. So I think there's a lot to be done in the realm of like pre-bunking, preemptively debunking misinformation, debunking misinformation. But also what we can do is we can really sort of invest in investigative efforts to see how is this interference taking place, right? Who is being paid by the Kremlin, let's say, to spread certain narratives, like the Czech Secret Service has recently done with this outlet called The Voice of Europe, where they discovered that it was basically funded directly by the Kremlin, and therefore they closed it down, right? But surely those operations are happening in a lot of places and in a lot of different ways. And so investing in knowing how that is happening exactly is very much worth the effort.
Thank you so much, Jon, and thank you for your efforts and teaching all of those possible solutions. Thank you so much for joining us. Thank you so much. Next, we'll meet an expert on the use of disinformation in times of crisis. And together, we'll look at some examples of influence operations.
The uncertainty that crises generate, that disasters generate, they trigger mental changes in how we process information. We'll struggle to remember details, and we may not remember critical things that are important, which can, of course, be problematic in things like evacuation. We give a preference to the first message we hear about something. So this is particularly something that bad actors can seize upon. We will struggle to update our knowledge in crisis, and that's taking in new information and reassessing what we think is happening. We look for information, but our instincts are not necessarily to look for credible sources of information. We are looking for comfort. We're looking for people that we know and trust and who care about us and who may not be positioned or informed enough to give good advice or information on the crisis. In 2010, when there was an earthquake in Haiti, there were over 2 million tweets about Haiti in the span of 2 days. People can just be like, I heard a thing, and post it. In the aftermath of the earthquake in Haiti, there was a story that appeared on a Venezuelan news outlet. And it claimed that Russia's northern fleet had reported a flawed U.S. Navy weapons test, and that this had caused the horrific events in Haiti, which is patently false. The public in various African nations are being targeted with what the public will probably recognize as the Ukrainian biolab story. And that story, it goes way, way back. People who are affiliated with Russian state media or have ties to the Russian state are promoting the idea that these humanitarian efforts are, in fact, human experimentation, or the United States actually developing biological weapons. The intent seems to be to generate a sentiment among the public that they don't want any of these health programs there, so that they then try to get their leaders to remove these programs. The potential impact of that, I mean, that would be devastating in terms of controlling HIV, controlling malaria, and also just our ability to control infectious disease globally.
Всім добрий вечір. Лідер фракції тут, голова Офісу президента тут, прем'єр-міністр Шмигаль тут, Подоляк тут, президент тут.
When the Russian invasion of Ukraine started in 2022, one of the things that I observed that I thought was remarkable and novel is how well the elected officials and leadership communicated with the public. They didn't publish fact sheets on their official websites. They got on Telegram, where people were, and they published things in plain language, and that's okay. They were prioritizing the immediacy.
Слава нашим захисникам, слава нашим захисницям. Слава Україні.
Last month, southern Poland saw enormous flooding that also unleashed a flood of disinformation and cybersecurity threats. the internet was filled with fake news and fake fundraisers. With war on Europe's doorstep, influence operations are happening more than ever before. Let's talk more about that with our next guest.
Jan Zając, entrepreneur, researcher, and social psychologist, founder and CEO of SoTrender and a strong advocate for deriving meaningful insights from reliable data. SoTrender is an analytics software platform that leverages social media data and AI algorithms. Through its solutions, the company helps hundreds of brands and agencies worldwide efficiently manage their social media channels and fight disinformation.
Jan, thank you so much for joining us in the Anatomy of Disinformation. And we have a pretext of us discussing today disinformation during crises. And, well, we just had a flood in Poland. And as many of the government officials, authorities, and institutions have been rising, that we also had a flood of disinformation. So what you're saying when we can talk about disinformation during crisis? Have you been in particular looking at the crisis disinformation during the flood?
Yeah, of course. There were some cases of, especially the gossips around the number of victims. So there were many gossips and just fake news about much higher number of disinformation, which were, by the way, spread mostly by accounts which we already know pretty well, that they've been spreading disinformation in many similar situations before.
So the accounts that you actually already are monitoring?
Not us, half of Poland, okay. Right? All authorities and NGOs that are doing fact-checking are monitoring them.
Have you been seeing something different than what already been seen, or rather really things that been previously on the Operation Influence have been?
I mean, so they were focusing on, first of all, we're trying to increase the reach of gossips, like about particular victims, but also later on about the total number of victims, which was far exaggerated. So far, officially, at the moment when we had like 7 victims confirmed, they were saying about hundreds of victims, and they were giving pseudo arguments that like we should check the funeral register, we should check at churches, we should check at local communities, and so on.
So they were basically trying to build up more of the fear, right, of what people were saying? That's kind of...
Of course, as well as also fear for the future events, because they were showing the incompetency of authorities, public services, and so on.
So you are seeing different networks operating in the internet and social media, and during different crises, they're becoming more active?
I'm saying that... Look, if there is like a big event, as a flood, for example, or a natural disaster, that's a big event, and almost everyone which is active in public sphere, no matter if it's like officials, politicians, journalists, but also fake news agents, they all feel entitled to talk and to say something. And yes, in such a moment, we're looking for news, we're looking for updates, especially if things are happening on weekends, which was the case in Poland. And then, there's a big number of various news, sometimes confirmed, sometimes not confirmed. So it's quite easy to sort of inseminate the gossip into the media system, first of all. But also, I'm sure that it's also a moment of test. So if you have some agents which are prepared both disinformation, counter-disinformation actions for the future potential events, could it be war, influx of refugees, other natural disasters? So such a natural disaster as a flood is a great opportunity to test their methods of influence people.
What are the other crises that you have seen that those networks been operating in?
Any. Starting from COVID, first of all. I think the pandemics was the great opportunity. Also because it took long and there were many nuances. But it also happened when the war in Ukraine broke off, but also in some other situation. I think nowadays you could expect that with every disaster or crisis situation, no matter it's natural or not, you would have quite a big amount of disinformation spread.
And that's very much based on the uncertainty that people are having and the vulnerabilities, right? Are you saying that those malign actors that are using those narratives are testing just the ground and looking what will work and what will not work, or they are really having some strategies?
I think both. So for sure there are some strategies just to increase uncertainty, to test the system, maybe to generate some public disorder. But it's also about testing with smaller events, something that they could potentially use later on with bigger events.
And those bigger events then is something that is a black swan, right? So we don't really know what is happening, but...
some of them you can
predict?
expect, like elections.
No.
For example, it's also a big event from this point of view.
It very much is. And have you been? And we are in the mega election year this year. So while you are monitoring disinformation and the Operation Influence, do you see that the same networks are operating during the elections and during crisis?
Yeah, that's quite interesting, and it's a phenomenon that was confirmed in a number of studies. Then you've got basically the same accounts and the same networks of accounts operating in different circumstances. And some of them, for example, that were disseminating then denialist approach during pandemics. Later on, they were spreading also Russian propaganda after the war in Ukraine broke off.
And are you saying, for example, that the accounts are changing? So they are first
Usually
becoming...
not.
No, so they are just
I mean, the content changes.
Okay.
Sometimes there is sort of like sleepy ones, and then later on become active again. So, no, because, look, as sort of capital, is a profile, you gather followers, you gather some visibility, some audience that could be potentially used also for other topics. Like, for example, again, pandemics was a great example because it was important for everyone. It was at least apparently politically neutral. So it's about half. Then even people who are not interested in politics saying, okay, yeah, that might be important, let's have a look into it.
And then different theories, conspiracy theories been raised, right? And are you seeing that some of the platforms are more vulnerable than others? And
of course. Come on, Twitter, nowadays known as X, because there's hardly any moderation and like the most emotional content is spreading. So that's the first example. Second is Telegram, which is pretty popular among different groups. Not very popular in general, but in particular groups it's very popular. But also, it's still, unfortunately, it's still relatively easy to spread disinformation on Facebook, on YouTube, other major social platforms.
So basically Twitter as still being one of the main sources of information, also for many journalists, right?
That's a pity.
That's a big pity.
Would you still say so?
I mean, I would unfortunately still say so, okay. Looking at how people are using the platform, right? But I think that we need to more and more raise the awareness of the trust and safety issue that definitely is being banned by the platform. But still, people are discussing about those accounts, and they can't believe what is true and what is not. So that's my question to you: like, how you actually can tell our audience how they can distinguish that there is an account that is working on it, and really, as the last question.
Check the news from a couple of sources. Check who's the account, what they've been publishing about what they're saying. Check if someone was repeated by a major media or an NGO or public institution that seems very reliable, but also like believe your own brains and try to process these things also rationally, not only emotionally, even if you are very scared of something, for example, natural disasters or some other problems.
And I think that's the most important. Thank you so much. Let's keep calm and really think rationally, especially when we're afraid. Thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you.
Let's now sum up what we've discussed today.
How does disinformation leverage existing crises? Disinformation exploits the confusion and uncertainty that accompanies events like the recent floods in Central Europe, where facts are still emerging and the demand for real-time updates is high. In these moments of heightened media attention, disinformation actors introduce false or misleading narratives to manipulate emotions, spread fear, or promote their agendas. Crisis-driven narratives thrive in environments of incomplete information, where speculation, rumors, and conspiracy theories can easily take hold.
Next time you wake up and check the news on your phone, only to read about yet another disaster, take a moment and think about what you can do for yourself to think rationally. Next week, we'll take a look at what's happening in Central and Eastern Europe and what tools we can use to counter disinformation. And until then, remember, keep calm and think deeply.